Throughout the creation of my major work, I've recorded and developed a large array of assets to utilize. This goes from Foley, to special effects, to footage, and even animations, each having their own design process, problems, and prototypes that impact my major work. I utilized the fractal noise effect and manipulated the size and spread of the noise. Then I enabled offset turbulence in order to give a more random and realistic effect. I then lowered the opacity of the noise in order to ensure that it gave off a smoke effect after it had been animated, as realistic smoke is see-through and gives off a shadow-like effect on top of the frame. This is a similar process to other special effects that I created, such as my fire effect and my portal effect, that both utilize a modified base layer of the fractal noise that is made specific to each component. I then created a basic logo reflecting Multimedia in Adobe Illustrator. Once I placed it on its own layer, I applied a saber mask to the text and animated the paths, allowing me to manipulate the direction the text traveled and the formation that it traveled in. I animated this to follow the pathing of the text and decided to give it an electric lightning type effect to fall into the theme of the intro. Overall, I'm not happy with this initial prototype. I feel like it came out looking very two-dimensional and cartoon-like, which was not the outcome I was looking for. A thought process to fixing this animation was to create a three-dimensional workspace. It's a directional lightning effect and animate the fork spikes and lengths of the directional path. After creating a solid layer with turbulent displacement, I created an array of shapes and objects to convey the natural texture of clouds. I created a new composite and applied a granite effect over the Multimedia Illustrator file. Using a CC glass effect, I was able to make a bubbly and a 3D type of layer. I then utilized the alpha channels to break the text through the granite, making it look more detailed. On the left hand side, you see my initial prototype, and on the right hand side, you see my final production with the clouds and lightning. I'm very happy with my final project, as I feel like it is a 3D and realistic environment that I intended to create. For my solo animation, I started off by creating a new composition within Autodesk Maya. From here, I developed each planet by creating spherical shapes and moving them into position along the workspace using the X and Y axes. From here, I created different textural properties for each individual asset within the composition. Within the settings, it allowed me to create textures such as blend textures that reflect light and would be used for the planets, and textures such as lamberts that did not reflect any lighting within the scene. This would be used for the sun. I encountered troubles when trying to rotate the planets. I found that when I positioned the pivot point of each individual planet to the center of the composition, it did not allow for each planet to rotate individually as they should. In order to fix this, I decided I needed to group each individual object to the sun and then rotate it from there. For lighting, I initially used a directional light from inside the sun and positioned the directional light beams away from the center of the scene. This enabled lighting on the inside of the planets but did not illuminate the sun. Through additional research, I was able to reveal that I needed to create a base surface shader with the texture of the sun in order to be illuminated when rendered. Finally, I animated the path of the camera to ensure that renditions were complete within the frame to create a picture sequence that looked visually pleasing and cinematic when rendered. Throughout my testing of 16, 24 and 60 FPS, I've identified that 24 frames per second would be the perfect option, as it allows me to convey animation smoothly without any stutters, and it also allows for fairly fast rendition times with reasonable file sizes compared to other ones. After testing an array of camera angles, I identified that these two presented on screen now were the best at creating a cinematic shot. Even with the power behind my desktop computer, I encountered issues when trying to render large lengths of assets such as special effects in high quality. I fixed this by dedicating my graphics card as the primary rendering power to ensure that I was able to effectively work on my project files. When developing my first prototype, I started by applying a tint layer with a linear wipe and a shadow effect. When I was animating the properties within the effect, I felt like they were of low quality and didn't really reflect the dusty and pixelated effect I was going for. I was not pleased with this effect I made, and I felt like I had to take a different approach to increase the quality. I started my disintegration effect by rotoscoping my actor to ensure that it tracked every motion that was made during the scene. I created a grey tint colour using the tint effect and the CC photo lens. From here I animated the mask path of the dust and the opacity in order to animate the dust to rise along the time sequence. I then created a black solid layer, naming it emitter, and then added a trapco particle effect to it. Then I parented the emitter layer to the duplicated layer of my actor. I expanded the particle settings and initially changed the type to cloudlet. This allowed for the base layer to be broken up into a dust type of formation. By animating the lifetime, the randomness, and the size of each particle, I was able to accurately create something that represented dust. From here, art and physics were applied to the pixels to move them from a specific direction, as well as giving them an effect that were floating and flying away from the subject. After seeing the final result of this effect, I'm extremely happy with the outcome, as I feel like it's a lot more realistic and detailed than the first prototype that I created. I created a stop motion animation using a still image that I took of my friend and animated each frame to create motion. This allowed me to get an understanding on the amount of time needed to dedicate to this component of my major work in order to ensure that I was able to create a detailed and effective animation. Before I could start animating, I first started off by going into Autodesk Maya and modeling the shape of a UFO. I then imported the UFO into Adobe After Effects, textured it, and placed it into the composition. Through testing and repeatedly replaying the animation sequence, I was able to identify that the UFO did not feel realistic due to lack of movement and depth. I developed a solution by manipulating the X, Y, and Z axes at every major movement within the sequence. I then created a smoke effect using Adobe After Effects and a plugin called Starlight. I was then able to create a middle layer and manipulate an array of different aspects such as particle types, densities, opacities, and shadows. I then added a wiggle sequence to the code to animate the mask and start at one point with full intensity, then fade it out over time. Overall, I'm very happy with the UFO animational sequence, as I believe it brings together an array of ideas to create a sequence that is short and sweet, while still contributing to the flow of production.